Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker for the morning, Joseph Pearce. Joseph first came to Houston to speak for us in 2002, and I think we were at what was then the Warwick Hotel, which I believe now is the Zaza over by the zoo. But we were doing a teachers conference there, and Joseph came in, and I had no idea that in 2002 we would be here 17 years later having these discussions. He is the author of 24 books, including The Quest for Shakespeare, Tolkien, Man and Myth, Wisdom and Innocence, A Life of G.K. Chesterton, and Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. Joseph has authored some 400 essays for our online journal, The Imaginative Conservative, and we are very pleased to welcome him for the first time to our breakfast here. So, Mr. Joseph Pearce.
Good morning. It's good to be here in Houston. And if you detect an accent, I just want to make it perfectly clear from the outset, I'm the only person in this room who does not have an accent. But I will do my best to understand you. So this is going to be a very brief talk within the theme of this morning's event, which is, if you like, the heroes and heroines who fought against the tyranny of the Soviet Union and of communism, and that Winston's asked me to speak on one of those heroes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Back in 1998, I was honored to go out to his home just outside Moscow to interview him for the research for my book, one of the great most moments of my life. But I'd like this morning to give just a brief talk based upon an editorial that I wrote for the St. Austin Review, which is a magazine that I edit, as well as writing for the Imaginative Conservative. I edit a magazine called the St. Austin Review, and this was originally published as an editorial, and I think it's the right sort of length to keep things brief here. The other thing about it, the other reason I wanted to use this is because it's about Winston. Not Winston Eliot, but Winston Smith. And those of you that have read 1984 by George Orwell will know that Winston Smith is the protagonist of that novel. And I want to, in this talk, I want to compare the real-life hero Solzhenitsyn with the fictional hero Winston Smith from 1984. It is over a century since the forces of secular fundamentalism unleashed an anti-Christian pogrom on the people of Russia. Declaring the liberation of man from God, the communists sought to murder the mass, replacing it with mass murder. In the following decades, tens of millions were sacrificed on the altars of atheism, as man, unshackled from the constraints of Christian morality, showed the horrific deadliness of his enlightenment. With perverse and infernal irony, men were slaughtered in the name of man. The seeming omnipotence of man was reinforced by the monolithic state, the political machine with which man crushed men. The man machine shoveled millions of men into death camps, feeding them like fodder to man almighty, the new god of materialism. This was the madness of Marxism, a madness that seemed to sweep the world before it in the first half of the last century. It seemed to be maddeningly charming, sweeping men off their feet and out of their heads. Its kiss was a curse, the kiss of death. In the midst of this Marxist maelstrom, a child was born. His name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was much like any other child of the revolution. He was brainwashed by the man-machine's education program and became a clone of the system. He fought for the machine during the Second World War, idolizing Stalin, the self-styled steel man, who was master of the machine, and he witnessed the raping and pillaging of Prussia as part of the Stillman's bloodlustful revenge on the Germans. He then committed the heresy of criticizing the Stillman in a letter to a friend. Denounced as a blasphemer against man, he was sent to prison, where he lost his faith in Almighty Man, and where he discovered for the first time the exiled God. Liberated from the slavery of subservience to a false God, Solzhenitsyn found his freedom whilst in prison. Turning his back on man, he learned to love men. The will made steel had been overthrown by the word made flesh. Later, after almost dying of cancer, he found life in his near-death experience. It was this near-death experience that led to his final conversion to Christianity. In his death was his resurrection. Now, aided by the risen God, he was ready to harrow hell itself. He was only one small man, seemingly powerless against the Soviet system. But aided by the God-man, he was ready to take on the might of the man-machine. Almost single-handedly and almost miraculously, this one man would play a major role in the overthrow of man almighty, at least in its Soviet incarnation. His devastating exposés of the horrors of communism in works such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and the monumental Gulag Archipelago undermined the very faith foundations of Marxism. His books, and the living example of his courageous resistance against the machine's efforts to crush him, served as a beacon of light penetrating to the heart of the darkness. Today, after the machine has ground to a halt and after the statues of the Stillman have been ignominiously toppled, it is easy to forget the enormity of Solzhenitsyn's achievement. Quite simply, what he did was considered to be impossible. It was beyond belief that one man could defy the communist state and survive. It was even more unbelievable that he should not only survive, but that he should play a significant role in the state's downfall, and that he should outlive the state itself. Solzhenitsyn's life and example flew in the face of the reality of the realists. The destiny of the small man who dared defy the man-machine was epitomized in the eyes of most pessimistic realists by the example of Winston Smith in George Orwell's novel 1984. Orwell's novel was published in 1948 when Solzhenitsyn was serving his sentence as a political prisoner of the Soviet regime. As such, the figure of Winston Smith can be seen as being not merely a figure of every man in his alienation from the man-machine, also known as Big Brother, but as an unwitting figure of Solzhenitsyn himself. According to the realistic view, Winston Smith would not only be crushed by the machine, he would also betray every ideal and everything he loved in abject surrender to the almighty state. The triumph of Big Brother was inevitable. It was preordained. It was fate, and to deny and defy fate was fatal and futile. The fact is that Orwell had failed to shake off the Hegelian determinism of his Marxist past. He had long since become disillusioned with Marxism, but still believed that the forces of history were immutable and the triumph of the man-machine inevitable. Orwell still believed, like his former comrades, that the man-machine was omnipotent. He only differed from them to the extent that he hated the omnipotent God, whereas they admired it. Solzhenitsyn, on the other hand, did not believe that the machine was a god, but merely a dragon, or a demon, a manifestation of evil. He did not believe in fate, but in freedom, the freedom of the will and its responsibility to serve the truth. Fate was a figment of the imagination, but the dragon was real. Furthermore, it was the duty of the good man to fight the dragon, even unto death if necessary. Solzhenitsyn fought the dragon, even though it was thousands of times bigger than he was, and even though it breathed fire and killed millions of people. He fought it because in conscience he could do nothing else. In doing so, he proved that faith, not fate, is the final victor. Faith can move mountains. It can move machines that were thought to be gods. It can move and remove Big Brother. Solzhenitsyn has rewritten George Orwell's novel using the facts of his life as his pen. He represents the victory of Winston Smith. And that's not all. He is also living proof that St. George slays the dragon, that David slays Goliath, and that Jack slays the giant. The saints are alive. The Bible is true. And fairy stories are more real than so-called realistic novels. Truth is not only stranger than fiction, it has a happier ending. Thank you.